It does not begin with a sudden decision or a reckless impulse, but rather with a gradual accumulation of observations that eventually reshape the way you see the entire crypto ecosystem. Because after spending enough time analyzing tokens, following launches, and watching how capital flows through decentralized markets, you start to realize that price movements are not driven primarily by utility or technological innovation, but by a much simpler mechanism: perception amplified by timing. At first, you resist that conclusion because it contradicts everything you initially believed about blockchain technology being a space for innovation and long-term value creation. But the more projects you study, the more you see the same pattern repeating with almost mechanical consistency, where minimal contracts paired with strong narratives outperform complex systems that actually solve problems. You begin to deconstruct this pattern methodically, almost like a system of equations, identifying its core components. A token contract simple enough to avoid technical failure, a liquidity pool calibrated to allow visible price movement, a distribution model that appears decentralized while remaining controllable, and above all, a narrative layer engineered to create belief before scrutiny has time to emerge. Once you reach that level of clarity, the question is no longer whether it works. The question becomes whether you can replicate it. You open your laptop late at night, not with excitement, but with a kind of detached focus, the same mindset you would have when testing a hypothesis. And you begin by deploying your first token on Ethereum, using a modified ERC20 contract, carefully adjusting parameters such as total supply, and implementing a small transfer tax mechanism that redistributes a percentage of each transaction to holders, not because it creates any meaningful economic advantage, but because it introduces a feature that can be marketed as passive income, which you already know is an extremely effective psychological trigger. You deliberately avoid adding advanced functionality, such as staking contracts or governance systems, because every additional layer of complexity introduces potential points of failure, and your objective is not to build something robust, but something that can survive initial inspection while the narrative does the rest of the work. After deployment, you immediately distribute the token supply across multiple wallets, each representing a different role within the ecosystem, ensuring that no single address appears dominant enough to trigger suspicion from experienced traders who routinely analyze token distribution as a first filter. You then create a liquidity pool on a decentralized exchange, pairing your token with ETH, and you spend more time than expected fine-tuning the initial liquidity parameters, because you understand that this is not a trivial step. If liquidity is too high, price movement becomes slow and unattractive, but if it is too low, the project appears unstable or abandoned. So you aim for a narrow range where volatility is high enough to create visible movement while still maintaining enough depth to support early transactions. The next phase is the narrative construction, which you now recognize as the most critical layer of the entire system, because without a convincing narrative, the contract and liquidity remain inert. You write the white paper in a structured format that mirrors legitimate projects, including sections on architecture, tokenomics, and future development, but you intentionally avoid defining anything in a way that can be falsified, instead relying on dense technical language and abstract descriptions such as adaptive cross-chain routing mechanisms, AI-enhanced liquidity optimization, which sound plausible without committing to any concrete implementation. You include diagrams that resemble system architectures, even though they do not correspond to any actual infrastructure, because visual complexity reinforces perceived depth, and most readers will interpret that as evidence of technical legitimacy without verifying its accuracy. The website follows the same philosophy: clean, minimal, fast loading, with just enough information to appear professional, but not enough to expose inconsistencies. You add a roadmap that suggests progression without specifying deliverables, because vague milestones are easier to maintain than precise commitments. When you launch the project, nothing happens, and that initial failure becomes one of the most valuable parts of the process, because it forces you to confront the fact that even a well-constructed system requires momentum, and momentum cannot be assumed. It has to be engineered. You spend 2 days attempting to generate activity through simulated engagement, posting from multiple accounts, creating discussions, replying to your own threads, but the absence of real participants makes the entire system feel hollow, and eventually you stop, not out of frustration, but because you realize that the problem is not the structure, it is the initial conditions. The second attempt is different from the beginning, because this time you approach it as a controlled experiment rather than a simple launch, preparing everything in advance, including a set of wallets specifically designated for initial transactions, and you execute a sequence of buys designed to create a gradual upward trend on the chart, spacing them over time to mimic organic market behavior. This time, the chart moves, not significantly, but enough to appear active. That is all it takes. Because traders scanning decentralized exchanges are not analyzing fundamentals, they are looking for movement patterns that indicate potential opportunity, and your token now appears as one of those patterns. The first real buyer enters, then another. You observe these transactions closely, not just in terms of value, but in terms of behavior, noting how even small amounts can reinforce the perception that something is happening, and you amplify this effect by continuing your own controlled activity, creating micro-volatility that draws attention without destabilizing the price. At this stage, the system begins to sustain itself. Real participants are interacting with a structure that was initially artificial, and their presence legitimizes it further. Then you receive a message from someone who has read your white paper in detail, and the tone of the message immediately stands out. Because it is not casual or speculative, it is analytical, referencing specific sections, asking how your proposed cross-chain mechanism interacts with existing infrastructure, and whether your system relies on external oracles for data validation. For a moment, you consider ignoring it, because it challenges the superficial layer you constructed, but instead you respond using abstraction, describing your system as modular and adaptable, which provides enough technical framing to satisfy the question without revealing that there is nothing behind it. The response works. The person is convinced. More than convinced. They ask to join your team. You accept, and that decision subtly changes the nature of the project, because now it is no longer entirely synthetic. It contains an element of genuine belief, which paradoxically makes it more convincing for everyone else. They begin contributing ideas, refining the white paper, suggesting improvements, and you allow it, because each contribution strengthens the external perception of legitimacy. The project grows steadily, and you begin to generate actual profit, converting portions of your holdings into ETH and then into stablecoins, carefully routing transactions through multiple wallets to avoid creating a direct link between your initial supply and your realized gains. You transfer part of the profits to a hardware wallet, isolating them from any online exposure, and for the first time, you see tangible results from something that started as a theoretical exercise. You exit gradually, distributing your cells across multiple transactions to avoid triggering a sharp decline, and the project fades naturally, losing attention rather than collapsing, which allows you to walk away without drawing suspicion. The third project is where everything accelerates significantly, because by now you have refined your process into a repeatable system, optimizing each component, from contract deployment to liquidity calibration to narrative timing. And you align your launch with broader market conditions, ensuring that your token enters an environment already primed for speculation. This time, traction begins almost immediately. Your Telegram fills with users discussing your project as if it already has value, and a mid-sized influencer mentions it, which introduces a level of visibility that you had not anticipated. The effect is exponential. Traffic increases rapidly. Transactions multiply. The chart becomes vertical. Your wallet balance grows accordingly, and you begin to convert profits more aggressively, moving funds across chains, splitting them into multiple paths, and securing a significant portion in cold storage, because you are now operating at a scale where a single point of failure could have substantial consequences. You upgrade your entire setup, investing in a high-performance computer with multiple monitors, dedicating separate machines for execution, monitoring, and research, effectively creating a controlled environment where each function is isolated to reduce risk. Then you start using the money in ways that extend beyond your immediate environment, paying off all your parents' debts, clearing outstanding loans and financial obligations, and transferring funds in a way that appears consistent with legitimate trading income. You purchase a house for them, ensuring that the transaction is structured cleanly, and you buy them a car, fully paid, eliminating the need for financing or bank involvement. When they ask how you achieved this, you explain it as success in crypto trading, which is vague enough to be believable, and they accept it because they want to believe it. You begin to integrate this new financial reality into your personal life, taking your girlfriend to high-end restaurants, purchasing expensive clothing and accessories for her, and living in a way that reflects the wealth you have accumulated, even though the underlying system remains fragile. At the same time, the project is becoming increasingly unstable, because its growth is no longer entirely under your control, and external participants are now influencing its trajectory in unpredictable ways. Someone loses a significant amount of money and begins messaging you persistently, explaining their situation in detail, how they invested based on your project, how they trusted it, how they believed in what you presented, And while you initially ignore these messages, they escalate, moving from direct communication to public analysis. They begin tracking wallets, posting transaction graphs, attempting to identify the developer. And when you review their analysis, you realize that while they are not completely accurate, they are close enough to be concerning. You respond immediately by moving funds across chains, introducing additional layers of separation, and breaking any potential links that could expose your identity. But the incident marks a turning point because it demonstrates that your system is not invisible. Shortly after, one of your wallets becomes blacklisted, containing approximately $80,000 that you can no longer move. And this event forces you into a period of intense analysis, where you spend nearly 2 days without sleep, tracing the source of the contamination, identifying which transaction intersected with the flagged cluster, and redesigning your routing process to avoid similar exposure in the future. You succeed in restoring functionality, but the margin for error has clearly decreased. Then the final escalation occurs when your personal accounts, those linked to your real identity, are frozen due to suspicious activity. And unlike previous incidents involving intermediary accounts, this one directly affects you. At this point, the risk is no longer abstract. It is immediate. You stop, not gradually, completely. You begin shutting down all operations, liquidating positions where possible, transferring the majority of your funds into cold storage, and ensuring that no active system remains that could be traced or monitored. You send $100,000 to your parents one final time, not as part of a plan, but as a precaution, ensuring they are financially secure regardless of what happens next. You pack lightly, taking only essential items and your hardware wallet, and you leave with your girlfriend without informing anyone, choosing a destination where you can disappear temporarily without attracting attention. In this new environment, the absence of constant monitoring, alerts, and transactions feels disorienting at first because you have adapted to a state of continuous engagement where every moment is tied to market activity. Gradually, that state fades. You begin to sleep normally again. You stop checking prices. You stop tracking wallets. One morning, you open your cold wallet and verify the balance, confirming that everything you preserved is still intact. And then you close it, not out of fear, but because you no longer feel the need to check it repeatedly. At that moment, you understand something that was not clear before. The system you built was effective, but it was not sustainable, and the only reason you kept what you earned is because you stopped before it forced you to. The money remains, stored, secure, but the process that created it is over, not because it stopped working, but because you chose to end it before it ended you.